So today we continue with part 2 on Spring Security using MySQL database. So we see how we can store user credentials in MySQL database. In the previous lesson, we see how we had coded. I'm going to show you how we had coded a few usernames and passwords in the configuration file. And this time we are going to get this user from MySQL database. Again, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to my channel by clicking on the subscribe button below. If you subscribe, you kind of motivate me to keep making these lessons, and also you don't miss an update. For instance, the next class is going to be how do we perform auditing in a Spring application using JPA auditing. So that we are going to do in the next lesson. So just click on subscribe so you don't miss an update. Now I'm going to test this application by right clicking on say run as Spring Boot app, so that we just continue from where we stopped. So if it runs, we'll be able to log in. So it says okay, Tomcat started, everything is okay. So if I try to access the application, it's going to tell me to log in. So if I go here, it tells me please log in, and I'm going to use one of those usernames and passwords I had coded, like Kindson and root. So let's say Kindson and root, and enter. It logged into the application we have assigned. So but this is hard-coded usernames and password. Let's now go to do MySQL. So I'm going to teach you how to configure MySQL database, set up MySQL database and the table, how to use MySQL Workbench, and how to configure user detail service in Spring. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is to configure MySQL database. By now, for you to use MySQL database, you should have MySQL database installed in your system. So download it from the website. It's free. Download MySQL community server and install it in your system. When you install it, then you can continue in this part. So it says to configure MySQL database, you need to add the necessary MySQL connection properties. So one of them is the driver, the password, the username, the URL, and the DDL Hibernate Auto set it to update. So I'm just going to copy this because this is a configuration for MySQL. I'm going to put it in the application.properties file at this point. So take note of the username, the password, the data source URL. Now this is the database. This database has to exist. We are going to create it right now because if it doesn't exist, then this application is not going to work. So I'm going to show you how to create a database. All right, so now there's another problem. We need to know about the time zone and also the port number. I'm going to explain this as we move on. All right, so now I'm going to go to open MySQL so that we can create a database in MySQL. So this is MySQL. I've installed it, and just go to MySQL Workbench. MySQL Workbench is a GUI that allows you to create a database. So open MySQL Workbench. Although you can also do this in command line, but I think it's easier using Workbench. So here you can see the port number is 3301. You can see. So I'm going to come here and change it to 3301. And I'm going to go to local instance, click on it, and enter the password root. Although you can use the password you use to configure your database. Now, if you open to MySQL database, you are likely to see the home at this point. You can also see once you are in the instance, you'll be in this page. Now, one thing you need to know is that database is called schema in MySQL Workbench. So you can't see where you do create new database. If you are looking for create new database, you're likely not going to see it. You're only going to see create new schema. So go to at this point, go to schemas and just right click at this point and say create schema. Create schema is the same as create database. So at this point it says name. Let's call it users.db because we want to store user information like the username and password in the database. So I'm going to call it userdb. That's the name of the database, userdb. And just say apply. That's the much you should do. after we've created a database successfully, the next thing we want to do is to create a table. To create a table, locate the database you created, users DB, and look for tables and just right click on it and say create table. When you say create table, it brings up this table creation dialog box. Give the name of the table. Let's call it user. And let's give columns like ID, username, and password. Let's keep it simple, just ID, username, and password. ID, okay, ID int, that is fine. Username, username should be Vaka, okay, and password should be Vaka as well. In real production application, you actually don't store the password in plain text like this, but this is a demo, and this not is this is the principle that Spring Security follows to store user credentials. So, but we are going to talk about how to enhance the security at a later tutorial. So this is gonna be ID is gonna be the primary key, and at this point I think we are done. And just click on apply, and let's say OK, and say apply. So it generates the SQL statement for you, and just say finish. Now we've created a database made up of ID, username, and password, made up of a table that has 3 columns: ID, username, and password. We are done with the MySQL at this point. So at this point, we need to also add some few dependencies. For instance, Spring Starter JPA. This means Java Persistence API, and it helps you to connect to database and be able to query a database without having to write so many codes by yourself. And MySQL connector helps to connect to MySQL database. It will be a different connector for different databases, but for now we are talking about MySQL database. So let's go to Maven repository to look for JPA. Maven repository is under Maven repository, and then you can find Maven repository. Sorry, not there. This is wrong. So Maven repository you can see right here, and we need JPA, data JPA. That's what we need. So we need Spring Boot data JPA startup. So I'm going to choose release 2.1.6. You can use any release depending on when you are using this tutorial. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go right into my pom.xml and paste it in the dependency section. So just paste it anywhere in the dependency section. It doesn't matter where you paste it, but it has to be in the dependency section. And we also need MySQL. So let's go to look for MySQL. We need MySQL connector J. That is what we need. So open it. I'm going to take 8.0.16. Again, you can choose any version you like. I'm going to copy the dependency, and I'm going to go right into the pom.xml of my application. And I'm going to paste it right there and do a little cleanup. All right. Spring's Boot data security, we already put it when we did tutorial 1. So let's see, we should have security somewhere. You can see Spring Boot data security. So having these dependencies, we can see you can copy it from here as well if you can't get to Maven. Now, since we have the dependencies, we also have the table in the database. We now need an entity that maps to this table. So we need a class that represents user information. This class is going to also have the same fields as the table in the database. So I'm going to just create a new class. I'm going to create a new class. I want to put this class in. Let me just put it in another package called models, and a new package called models. But it doesn't matter where you put it. I'm going to call it user. Call it the same name as you call the table in your data, the same name as the table you created in the database. All right, so finish, and it's as simple as just adding ID, first name, ID, username, and password. So you can say private integer ID private string username and private string password. Okay, so this is the tree you need. Now we need to annotate this class to be entity because we want to tell Spring that this class maps to a table in the database. So I'm going to annotate it with the entity annotation. The ID or the primary key has to be specified using the @ID annotation as well. Alright, so press Ctrl+Shift+O on your keyboard. It's going to put in the right namespaces, and this is fine. Okay, so let's just add a few constructors. Okay, let me just generate these constructors from source here. Right click, go to source, and just say generate constructors using field, and just say generate. And the next thing you want to do is to generate getters and setters at this point. Go to source and then choose generate getters and setters. Generate getters and setters, and select everything and just say generate. It's always a good practice to have an empty constructor as well. So let me just put an empty constructor. Sometimes a constructor, you can see it as a function with the same name as a class. So there is an empty constructor. So we are done with creating the entity model. So this is the procedure we just followed right now. All right. Now, if you have an entity that accesses a database, you also will need a repository. A repository is like an interface to the database, a class that interfaces with the database. So I'm going to simply create a new repository. So I'm going to say new. I'm going to say new class. A repository should be an interface. So I'm going to say new interface. And the name is going to be user repository. So user repository because the name of the model is user, and then call it repository. I like to put it also in another package called repositories. So I put my repositories in there. All right. So we are making progress. Again, you need to annotate the repository with @repository annotation. One thing I forget to mention is that this repository, user repository interface, should extend JPA repository. If you extend JPA repository, then we have methods that already has been implemented for us and we can easily use. So I'm going to say it should be extends JPA repository, and you specify the class you want to use as your model and the primary key type, which is integer. The integer is the primary key type in this model here. Okay. So I'm going to save everything. So JPA repository comes from Spring data the JPA repository. Okay. All right. User comes from from models. Okay. Perfect. All right. So let's see where we are. So again, I'm going to write a method, or more like I'm going to define a method, and that method will be find by username. So if you provide the username, the repository is going to find this user by username. So you simply define this method, and then the implementation will be there for you. So simply say a user finds by username. So if you have find by password, but you can never do that, find by and then find by username. So find by, and you specify the name of the field. This is the format you use, and then you'll be sure that JPA is going to have the implementation of this method. String username. All right. So this is where we are. We've created our repository. Everything is fine. We now need to configure our authentication provider, and that we are going to do. Remember, we created an app security config file. We are still going to use the same app security config file, but we are now going to provide something called authentication provider object. All right. So the steps you are going to follow, first we are going to go to, let me just close up a few things here. We are going to go to app security config file, and we are going to delete everything in here. So we are going to delete everything in here, delete everything from here. And the next thing we're going to do is to auto-wire our user details service into this class. So I'm going to, the reason is because security configuration have to use user information that is coming from somewhere. So I'm going to say user details service, user details service. So it's going to be a private member variable and is going to be auto-wired into this class. Okay. All right. So let me scroll up a bit. Okay. Now we need to create a public method that returns authentication provider object, and now I name it auth provider. We are going to create a public method that returns authentication provider object. So I'm going to say authentication provider, a public method, so public authentication provider auth provider provider. Okay, so it's going to be a public method, and all right. So now this method that returns authentication provider type is going to be a bean, right? It's going to be a bean. Okay, so set the user details service of this provider. I think okay, yeah, good. So it's going to be a bean, that is fine. Now create a new DAO authentication provider object. So I'm going to say DAO authentication provider is equal to new DAO authentication provider. Okay, let me just check. Someone is sending all these messages to my phone. Okay. Okay, sorry. All right, so authentication provider comes from here. Okay, fine. Auth provider. Okay, we need a return statement. Okay, fine. Set the password encoder of this provider to no op password encoder. So I'm going to say provider dot set password encoder to no op passwords encoder dot get instance. So I'm setting the password encoder. For sure you will not be using no op password encoder because it's not secure. That is why it's highlighted in green. So we also need to set the user details of this provider as well. So meanwhile, let's follow the steps the way it is, because I don't want you to skip any step, because if you make some mistakes by skipping a step, it's not going to work at the end of the day, and it's going to be difficult to debug. All right, so at this point, let's return the provider. Return provider. Although we are not done with this provider because we need user details information as well. So then return the DAO authentication provider. That is fine. So this is where we are at this point. Okay. All right. So now we are now going to create the service layer. So the service layer is an interface. It's used to retrieve user-related data from the repository. So the repository that we created before, user repository, talks to the database to get some data. Now the service layer, which is also a class, an interface, is going to be talking to the repository. The the repository talking to the database, and user details service talking to the repository. That is how it works generally. All right, so go to the repository. I think, is there an error anywhere? So okay, everything is fine. So I'm going to just create a new class. This new class, I'm going to call it new class. Okay, let's try to follow the steps exactly the way it is. So I'm going to create a class called MyUserDetailsService. So now this service, I want to put it in the services package, because it's good to separate different kind of classes to different sections of your program. So put it different packages have to contain different classes. So this is going to extend user details service. So let's see. Add user details. Create a new class, my user details service. In the new class, add user details service interface. This. So this is actually wrong. You add user details service interface. So I'm going to say okay. Hopefully everything is fine. So I'm going to say finish. Okay, good. So this is where we are. Now this is a service. I'm going to then annotate it with the add service annotation. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to take out this so that we have some space. Auto wire the repository into the service. So always when you create a service, and that service, that application have a repository, you need to auto wire the repository into the service. So you simply create a private member variable of the repository type. So I'm going to say user repository, user repository, user repository. Okay. Okay, perfect. And I'm going to auto wire it by adding auto wire. All right, so at this point we should be almost fine. Auto wires, yeah, fine. All right, so going by the step by step, we have step 4, inside load by username method, create a user object. This object calls repository find by username method, personate the username parameter, validate that if the user is null, then throw new username not found exception. So at this point, I'm going to create user is equal to user is equal to user repository dot find by username, and specify the username, and this is fine. All right, so this user should be the user we have. I'm going to save everything, and this user should be coming from here, from the models. Make no mistake about it, this is a user coming from the models. Okay. Let's see. Okay, everything should be fine. Okay, so I'm going to now say if user is null, if user null, if user is null, I'm going to throw new exception, new user name not found exception, username not found exception. That exception is going to say user not found. Okay. So after throwing this exception and it happens that the user exists, just return the user. Return new user principal user. So now, why do we not return the user? Why do we have to return user principal? The reason is because user principal is the wrapper class that we will use to wrap the user, because User principal provides us all the functionalities that we need to manage a user. For instance, you need to check if the account have expired, is account locked, possible to change password after some time. So there are a whole lot of things that have to be done to manage a user, and user principal does this for us. Now, user principal is actually user details, and user details is provided for us. And at this point, the next thing we are going to do is to create or implement the user details interface. So being an interface, it provides core user information as well as methods for managing users. So the first thing to do to create a user principal, which is a user details interface, is to create a class inside the models package, and this class will implement user details interface, and we are going to choose the interface from the new class dialog box. Now let me do it so that you see how it goes. I'm going to go to the models package and I'm going to say new. I'm going to say new class, new class, that is fine. And the name is user principal. The principal is simply a current user, in case you don't know. We need to add the interface user details, so you have it here, but in case you can just type it here, user details, and you see it's here, the first one, right? Click on it and say OK. At this point, just say finish, and you can see that this user principal, which implements user details, provides us with a whole lot of methods for managing user details or user data. And for now, we say is enabled, blah blah blah, is credential not expired, is account locked. Let's set them to true so that we'll not have anything to prevent the application from not working. So let's just set it to true. So all the account is open, it's not locked out, it's not expired. Now we need to add one more private field to this class. Remember, we say this class is going to be used as a wrapper class for the user we created. So it means this class is going to also take a user and create and give us the user details. So I'm going to come here and say public, or you can just say right click and just generate the constructor, say source, and just generate. Oh no, we need a user. So private user, I think I'm getting it, yeah. So create private field of user, okay. Private user, and I'm going to just say, let me just make sure, okay, this is user coming from models, okay. So let's generate the constructor by saying source and just say we generate the getters and the setters, and as well as the constructor. So let's start with generating the constructor. It's just one field to generate, fine. Now, do we need to generate getters and setters? No, we don't need to generate getters and setters. Now we need to modify the get password and get username. Instead of returning null, it's going to return user.getPassword. So I'm going to return user.getPassword, and here instead of returning null, it's going to return user.getUsername. All right, so this now is a class that we have, and it has provided all the core functionalities for managing a user. At least not necessary for us to be doing it by ourselves. So that is one thing you should bear in mind. All right, get authorities is also necessary to modify. So at this point, get authorities is like roles, like the roles user, admin, administrator, super user, and stuff like that. So it's going to return collections.singleThing new simple granted authority, and it's gonna be just user, just a simple role called user. Again, you have all the code here in my website in case you're missing out on anything. If you've not subscribed to my channel, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, and if this makes sense to you, hit leave me a comment below to let me know, and feel free to like and share my video if that is okay for you. Alright, so I'm going to just put in the import statement. Okay, so at this point we need to tell the configuration file to use the user details at this point. So let's come back here. So see how we have the user principal here. We have the user principal right now. We created it, and it's going to be this one. I'm going to save everything. The next thing we may have to do is to, let's see, final. Okay, so we need to set the user details service of the provider So if we go to the configuration file, this one, we set the password, but we need to set the user detail service. So I'm going to say provider dot set user details service dot set user details service, the second one, and it's going to use user details service. Perfectly okay. Okay, hope we are not forgetting anything. No. Okay. So if I run this application, it's going to work, but have we defined any password and username? Maybe not. Of course, there might be error if we run this file. Let's see. All right, so one of this error might be from time zone. I mentioned it earlier on. So if you look at this place, it says unknown users DB, unknown users DB. So let's go to properties file 3301 users DB. If we go to check the name of the user, sorry, the name of the database. Now I'm going to teach you something very important. So instead of going to Workbench, I'll just go to command line and check the name of the database. So I'm going to say show databases. So you can say here is userdb, not usersdb. So I'm going to just change it to userdb. And I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to relaunch the application again. So, all right, so we should have an error that has to do with time zone. So let's see, because this error is something that you need to know. So it says the server time zone, blah, 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 is unrecognized and so on. So to solve this problem, at the end of the data source URL in application properties, just append your time zone, and this, you are going to do it this way: server time zone equal to UTC. Okay. All right. So that's what I'm going to do. What else am I forgetting? Okay. Again, take note that we don't have any users in the table in the database, but we'll try to run this application anyway to see if it works. So Tomcat started, everything is fine. So I'm going to come here and try to refresh this page, and it says login. But what username do I use? What password do I use? For now, we don't have. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to MySQL and put in some users into the database. So I'm going to use Workbench. I'm going to come here. I'm going to say root. Okay. So okay, so I think I typed the password wrong. So right. So yeah. So let's go to userdb, and this time we are going to go to table. I'm going to just expand it and say select, and I'm going to put in some username and password. So let's try Achilles. Achilles is going to be gift, and Hercules Hercules is going to be gold. Those are the two usernames and passwords we have. I'm going to say apply and then error. Why? Error is coming from somewhere. Why? Oh, ID doesn't have a default value. Okay, no problems. I'm going to say 1 here and I'm going to say 2 here. Then apply, finish. Alright, so if I come back here and I say Hercules, I think is gold. So let's see. So it logged in perfectly well, so as you can see. Also, if we try the other one, Achilles, if I type in the wrong thing, it doesn't work. So let me type the correct one. Achilles and should be gifts. Gifts, yeah. It worked. So this is how to configure MySQL and use MySQL to store login and user credentials. Let's do a quick recap of what we just did. And the recap is based on the captions. First, we configured MySQL database. We added the dependencies. We created the user entity. We configured Authentication Provider in the app security config file that extends web security configure adapter, remember? We created a user details service, created a user repository. User details service actually created after we created the user repository. Then we created a class that implements user details. We call this class user principal. And finally, we set the password encoder in the app security config file and also set the user details of the DAO authentication provider in the configuration file. So this is how we come to the end of this module. Now I'll recommend you do it a couple of times. The next question you may ask is, how do we then get users into the database? How do we create a registration page that allows users to create their own usernames and password and just register and have their user information? How do we add strong password encryption so that our password will not be stored like a plain text? These are questions we are going to discuss in the next lesson. I would recommend subscribe so that when I update or make this new lesson, you get notified. Also, you encourage me or motivate me to keep making this lesson for you. And I'd like to see your comments coming, and we'll see you in the next lesson.